Hey everybody, welcome to episode 125 of the Askdap show, where I answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. On this episode, I talk about dropping oil pan on Audi A4, blowing up engines on Mark 7s, swapping North American LED taillights from facelift cars into first generation Mark 7s, and TSI, FSI, and the TFSI designation.
Ben via YouTube says, "Hey, I have a B8 A4 and I'm getting ready to replace the oil pump. Looking at the oil pan, there seems to be a bar that connects to the frame and motor mounts. Will I have to remove that bar or can I do it through the tiny cracks?"
Okay, Ben, so I'm not sure specifically about the oil pan dropping on that B8 2.0T engine, but I can tell you this. A lot of longitudinal engines, just so for anybody not familiar, VW and Audi has two different engine, or really all cars have two different formations of engine, which would be longitudinal, which would be front to back, or transverse, which would be side to side. And so most Audi models, because their Quattro will be longitudinal, with the exception of some of the current model stuff that is also transverse. For general rule of thumb, most Volkswagen engines would be mounted transversely, most Audi engines would be mounted longitudinally. The B5 Passat would be one car that was actually different than this, but I can tell you from experience, because of that B5 Passat, that a lot of times the oil pans would wrap over the top of the subframe in the rear, and so what we would have to do is support the engine, drop the subframe, because it is the support for the, I believe for the engine and transmission as well. I think the motor mounts attach to the part of the subframe as well, if my memory serves me correctly. And so you have to support the engine and then drop the subframe down to allow the oil pan to come off and clear over top of it, because it had kind of a dome shape that was built into that. So if that car, the B8 2-liter turbo, again, which I'm not super familiar with, but if it's similar to that, then I would say yes, you're going to have to drop the subframe, which if you were doing it on the ground is easier said than done. You'd have to use like a floor jack or something like that, but then it also gets hard to be able to get it back up in place and that type of stuff. So that would be most likely what you're going to have to do in that circumstance. If you do have something that has to be dropped relating to that oil pan, I don't know how easy that's going to be able to do on the ground.
Felix via YouTube says, "Love the channel and the new shop. On a side note, can we do a video on the early MQB motors blowing up? I myself grenaded a piston among many others. I've talked to Stock and Tuned. My motor for my Mark 7 GTI had a build year of 2014. I think it's crazier that there hasn't been a recall."
Okay, so this question is around Mark 7 engines and why I haven't discussed engines blowing up. So this is something that it definitely has happened, and I've heard of it, but I think oftentimes, a lot of times people on the internet think a problem is more prevalent than it actually is. So from my experience, Mark 7 engines have blown up, and there has been a fair number of them. A lot of them are tuned, and there's some questionability relating to the tuning. And if, I've heard of a lot of tunes before they blew up, they were having knock issues and they were having misfire issues and that type of stuff before they actually blew up. Again, that's anecdotal, that there's no data of broad investigation around that. But I can tell you, the issue with engines blowing up is not super widespread, and while it does exist, it's not a problem that I feel like talking about. It does more than just create hysteria around people being concerned that their engine is going to blow up, when there's no evidence that it's a super widespread problem, at least as far as I know at this point, and there's not a lot of preventative you can do around it in the first place. So because of that, I think it's more talking about it ad nauseum. First of all, I don't think it's as big of a problem as most people believe it is, and then also there's nothing actionable around it other than if it happens, try to get it covered under warranty, and that would generally be the issue. But again, because of it's not a prevalent issue in my eyes, I would say it is something that doesn't necessarily have a lot of benefit to talk about widely.
A user on Instagram says, "Will North American Mark 7.5 tails swap directly onto a Mark 7 model?"
All right, so will North American facelift LED taillights swap into a Mark 7? So yes, physically they'll swap in. The electrical connectors are different, so you will not be able to plug them in. You would need an adapter harness. And I know that's probably going to bring the next question of, are we developing an adapter harness for it? I'm actually not developing an adapter harness for it, mostly because I don't know that the market is out there widely enough for us to spend R&D time and money to develop something like that. If it becomes more clear over time that that may be a thing that happens, I may do that. We've just finalized development and we are starting production and going to be doing pre-orders any day now on the facelift, the North American facelift cars to upgrade to the European facelift highline taillights with the dynamic turn signals. So look for that pre-order. I'll link to it in the description below for anybody who's interested. But we are not planning to do anything with swapping one from the other, mostly because it's not necessarily going to be something that is economical for most people. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And again, if things kind of progress and it makes sense for us to do the R&D to do it, we may look into that, but it will require a harness and coating to make that function in a Gen 1 Mark 7.
Paul via YouTube says, minus 5.69 out of tolerance, valve cover, upper and lower timing covers, chains plus guide, bolts, cam seal equals $23.48.
Okay, so this was a comment that was actually left on our recent timing video that we did, showing you how, I believe it was the how to check timing video that we recently put out. This was more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to touch on it because I thought I had some things to share about it. So he mentions that his car is out of time or out of range by 0.69, and it's $2,349 to replace this stuff. I wanted to touch on that because, first of all, that is definitely more than what I would expect to pay for that type of job. Really depends on what you're replacing, and maybe you're overpaying for parts. So we have a timing kit for most engines, which is right around $540, I think, and that includes all the guides and tensioners and chains for the two main chains. We don't include the oil pump chain, mostly because I think it's just going to add cost. And there's no evidence that we've heard of them stretching at this point. Because of that, I'm a little bit curious as to where that pricing is coming from. If you are replacing like a cam bridge and anything else you could possibly replace while you're in there, certainly the cam bridge is going to be expensive. I want to say they're roughly around $250-ish. So if you were to replace chains and guides and a cam bridge from us, we're probably looking at somewhere in the $700 to $800 range. And then if you're doing the labor yourself, obviously, then there's no cost associated with that. If you are doing the labor yourself, obviously we're at the shop right now. We could do the work for you here. I don't know off the top of my head what the price point that you're going to be looking at for that particular work, but I would expect it to not be that amount. We're talking about another $1,000, $1,200, $1,500 in labor. I would not expect it to be $1,500 in labor for that work. So, it's something to consider is maybe get a second opinion from other places that are qualified, and something that I recently touched on with somebody who I talked to on the phone that was a customer. He had somebody who he took it to who recommended him shocks and springs and the complete assemblies for his car because of the suspension noise. That to me is always a red flag whenever I hear things like that, because that's not something that you would generally replace every component in the system. That's something that a lot of aftermarket shops do because they just don't know what to replace, so they just replace everything. I always recommend get a second opinion from somebody who's a Volkswagen Audi specialist like us or anybody else who can help you, because even though sometimes you spend a little more on labor, because you're not being sold a bunch of parts you don't need, you end up saving money. So that would be my advice, is get a second opinion, because that price does seem a little higher than I would expect.
Alex Gunner via YouTube says, isn't the engine from this video a TFSI engine?
Okay, so this question was left on our TSI timing chain video as well, and I understand why people get confused with this stuff. Volkswagen and Audi have done a bad job in helping people identify engines. So really the only way to know for sure what engine you're discussing is based on engine code. But the best way I can describe it, and maybe I should shoot a separate video just so we can explain to people all the separation between the different videos so we can know exactly which one we're talking about when we use this verbiage. So I'm going to use 2 or 3 different variations of when I'm talking about Volkswagen Audi engines. And sometimes I'm going to use TSI, FSI, or engine code, and then I may talk about things like MQB engines or Mark 7 engines because they have some variation there. So first, let's start with FSI. FSI is a engine that was found in most Volkswagen Audis between 2006 and 2008.5. 2008.5 is a split year. They changed to a newer 2-liter, which was the TSI engine at that point. So the TSI engine was the one we were discussing in that video, and that engine came from 2008.5 till around 2014, 2015. Some Volkswagen Audi models a little bit later than that, but that's a general year range, 2014, 2015, 2016, depending on car. That's the TSI engine. Now, the TFSI is something that you're going to see as a designation on engine covers. Audi is famous for this. They even still do this to this day. A lot of current Audi engines say TFSI on them. It's not an inaccurate designation. It's just not the designation that somebody like myself or a VW and Audi tech would use to describe the engine. So I understand why it's super confusing, because you would think that when it says TSI on the engine or FSI on the engine or TFSI, that we're discussing exactly what it says on the engine. We're not. We're discussing the type of engine it is. And while a lot of them are going to be all TSI or TFSI, which oftentimes will designate the type of injection that they're using, is not necessarily a designation you're going to find on the engine. So when we say TSI, generally we're going to be referring to engines with the engine code CCTA and CBFA. That's going to be your two most prevalent ones that are found in Volkswagen Audi models. There's another Audi variation of that TSI engine, which is what's called a valve lift engine, which means it has a variable valve lift. The CAEB engine, which was also had similar problems and similar issues to the TSI engine, but it's not exactly the same engine. And then the later ones that say TSI or TFSI on there, which would be Mark 7 engines and MQB stuff, they're a completely different engine. They do not have any of the same problems that you would find in TSI, or at least not that we're aware of at this point, because they're just not around aged long enough to know exactly what problems they're going to have. But that's hopefully kind of a 101. And again, maybe I should do an in-depth kind of explaining each engine and showing you the differences between all of them as a separate video to allow people to kind of know concretely exactly what we're looking at. So hopefully that helps clear that up a little bit for you. Thank you so much for watching episode 125 of the Askdap Show, where I answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.